Hi, everybody. I'm Doug Schurch, a member of the Schurch Family Association of North America Symposium Committee. On behalf of the association's executive committee, I'd like to welcome you to our fifth symposium, which features a presentation by a Schurch family notable, former professional football player and photographer, and current mentoring thought leader, Jerry Martin Schurch, whose code, I believe, is H2207322. The symposium series events are designed to increase the opportunities to learn about our fascinating and frequently heroic Schurch family. The series is just part of the association's drive to expand and teach the knowledge of our ancestors. For example, we are tracing the living locations of your Schurch ancestors in Europe during the 18th century and are planning a symposium on this topic during the first part of 2023. Also, we are researching Schurch genealogy through DNA techniques. We also conduct a reunion every 2 years and publish a newsletter twice a year with both paper and digital subscriptions. Subscription information is available at the association's website, which is located at www.schurchfamilyassociation.net. That's www.schurchfamilyassociation.net. Our Schurch family notable presenter tonight was born in Grants Pass, Oregon, which is in the southern part of the state and near the cultural center of Ashland, Oregon. The second son of Doris and Dick Schurch, Jerry earned All-American honors as a wrestler at Oklahoma State University before being selected in the second round of the 1970 NFL draft by the Cleveland Browns. As a nerdy, undersized, picked on 10th grader in high school, I remember how proud I was to see the Schurch name on the back of an NFL uniform when the Browns were on TV. I was soon claiming that Schurch was a cousin. Of course, through the SFANA database, I eventually learned that while distant, Jerry was indeed a cousin. After a 12-season career in the NFL and being named to the league's Pro Bowl for 4 consecutive years, Jerry took up sports photography. His work appeared in numerous newspapers as well as in Sports Illustrated and Pro Magazine. As illustrious and impactful were those 2 careers, it is his work in youth and adult mentoring for the past 25 years that has made the most powerful and long-lasting contribution to society. Today, Jerry Schurch is a thought leader in the development and deployment of mentoring programs for a wide variety of government and corporate entities, as well as youth-serving organizations. During today's symposium, Jerry's going to share his perspective on the purpose and outcomes that can be achieved through successful mentoring, especially among vulnerable populations. In addition, he'll share a few memories from the gridiron and wrestling mat and show us some of his photography. At the end of his conversation, Jerry will take your questions. To submit questions, use the chat feature, which is accessible via placing your computer cursor over the chat icon that is typically at the bottom of your screen and clicking your cursor. The chat window will pop up and you can type in your question or comment and then press enter. At the conclusion of tonight's presentation, I will read the questions received and Jerry will provide answers as time allows. We've scheduled today's event for 1 hour. I'd like to remind everyone this event is being recorded and we will be archiving it on YouTube with links from our association's website and Facebook page. All participants at today's event have their lines muted during the presentation and during the Q&A session that will follow the presentation. I'd like to thank the Symposium Committee for all the time and effort they have spent in bringing today's event to you. The committee requests that any input on our events, including corrections or additions to the information presented, be sent to schurchsymposium@gmail.com. Finally, I'd like to remind our audience and our family that symposium presentations are by Schurchs about Schurchs. If you have a topic of interest or would like to explore joining the committee, please contact us at schurchsymposium@gmail.com and one of our committee members will be in touch. And now I'm delighted to turn the microphone over to Jerry Martin Schurch.
Thank you, cousin Doug Schurch. And by the way, before I get started, do I have the correct screen up, Doug? Are you seeing full screen? I think you may have muted yourself.
Yes, you're good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Yay. First of all, I want to just say I'm honored to be considered a notable Schurch, and it's so good seeing all the Schurch names come up on Zoom there, and then everybody else who may be married to a Schurch or be interested in the Schurch family. I'm living in Encinitas, California. That's just north of San Diego. And we have a nice sunny day here. We hope that you're having a good Saturday wherever you are. But I'm just really honored to be talking to you all. And also, this is the first Zoom webinar I've done where I have a lot of family on. I believe my mother, who will be 100 years old in January, is on. And I've got several cousins from Texas, a niece from Canada, and I think my brother and sister-in-law from Dawson Creek, British Columbia. So I'm very honored that they're on, and again, honored to be considered a notable. And I want to thank Doug for the work that you've done and in the committee and helping me put this together. And just a little roadmap of what we're going to talk about today, or what I'm going to talk about. I'm just going to touch on mentoring starting out. Just because so much of my life has been focused on having good mentors, and the reason I eventually got into mentoring is because I had good mentors. So I just want to touch on it briefly, and then I'll come back to it. And then I'll talk about my NFL experience and show some of that NFL experience through the photographs I took, mostly behind the scenes for the NFL. And then I'll talk about my move into psychology and mentoring and why I did that, because basically I was having a transition in my life, trying to find the oomph in my life after football. And then I'll get back to the topic of mentoring and talk about the two basic types of mentoring, which are structured or organized program and informal mentoring. Informal mentoring will cover some strategies and tools that you can use to mentor in your everyday life. And we'll cover the qualities of an effective mentor, and then also get into successful adult development. As I'm getting older, I'm trying to figure out how to age successfully and age gracefully, and it kind of ties in with mentoring and human development. So I'll share some of the things that I found, and then I'll go to a short reading list. So to start out, what is a mentor? A mentor, if you look in the dictionary, you'll find a pretty good definition. It usually says a mentor is a wise and trusted friend, and it's usually older, more experienced person that focuses on the development of a younger person. So really important in mentoring is the focus on the other person and their needs. And then in mentor training, I always talk about the 3 R's of mentoring. The most important things. It's not reading, writing, arithmetic, but it's relationship, relationship, relationship. So that makes mentoring different than teaching or coaching or a lot of other ways with, interacting with folks. And I think this is my last slide on, actual mentoring until the end of the presentation. But just wanted to cover that there are structured mentoring programs, and that's what I do right now. I'm a consultant, and I help train program staff. I help train mentors about how to develop relationships with young people. So I started out in youth mentoring, and I still do mostly youth mentoring. And an example most people know is Big Brothers and Big Sisters. They're all over United States, Canada, and then actually the world. But there are all types of mentoring programs, and I'll talk about those later, some of the ones that I've helped. And then also in business, I've helped business-based mentoring programs. And I think it's just interesting that most corporations and most Fortune 500 companies, and I think it's something like 85% have a structured mentoring effort. So they also see the value in mentoring. And then over the past 25 years, I've helped both youth mentoring programs. I've actually helped several hundred youth mentoring programs, and then a few score maybe of adult initiatives, including the federal government, including the Air Force and the Navy. And I wanted to start out and get a little cuddly here. This is probably my favorite picture of my mom and dad, and I've got them up here because they are the foundation of Jerry Schurch, of me. I just had a really great upbringing, and along with brother Dan too, but my father Dick Schurch and my mom Dora Schurch. And this was about 1952 in Grants Pass, Oregon, in our little house on Elm Street. I was probably 4 years old. And I was just thinking as I put this in the PowerPoint, they were probably smiling because Dan and I were probably in bed by then and quiet, and they had a little peace in their lives. And I want to talk a little bit more about them. My dad passed away about 20 years ago. Both my mom and dad are helpers with servant hearts. And my dad was a plasterer, a hard worker. There he is in his plastering clothes, although this is after he retired and he was working on our property in Cardiff, California. He had a chainsaw. He also had a green thumb. He was a Boy Scout leader, and you know, every month or two I'll get an email or see somebody on Facebook that says, you know, your dad was a great mentor and a role model to me. And he was an outdoorsman. He was raised in the woods of Oregon part of the time, and took us hunting. He knew everything about the outdoors. And my mom was a longtime school teacher, and I get messages about mom to this day by students that she had, 30, 40 years ago, maybe 50 years ago, because she was such a wonderful school teacher. And she also has a servant's heart. And again, they are my main mentors. Wanted to mention brother Dan too. He was a mentor and a role model. He became a really good musician. And as I grew up, I saw him practicing and heard him. He would go into the bathroom and lock the door and play his trumpet. And I saw how much work that he put in, and he became first chair in the high school band in Grants Pass, which was a really good marching band. Here we are in Oregon. My folks would take us camping. We were at a Highland Lake here. This is a string of fish we caught. So I am on the right there. Dan is older. He's 3 years older. He's on the left. So I had a wonderful upbringing. And I realized that this can't be my life story as far as detail. So I'm going to take a big jump here. I didn't do well in sports. I actually dropped out of football in the 7th grade, and I didn't go back until the 12th grade. One thing, my mom didn't want me to get hurt. And I listened to her until I got so big that a coach came along and said, "You're going out for football next year." And the other thing is, I just wasn't that great of an athlete. I wrestled, but I didn't have any success until I was a senior. And I was small. I weighed 148 pounds as a sophomore in high school. And then I went 168 as a junior, 190 as a senior. And by the time I hit junior college, I was probably 220 or 30. And I just don't know how that happened. I didn't take steroids, and all at once I was bigger than everybody. As you can see in this picture, I went to Grays Harbor Junior College, and I started to bloom there. I became captain of the wrestling team. I beat everybody for 2 years, pinned everybody the first year. So that guy reaching out with an arm that looks like a leg, that's 4 years earlier. It was a 148 pounder. I look like the guys on the right. And then I eventually got a scholarship to Oklahoma State, where I wrestled and played football, and started to even, get more athletic skills, not only the big body, but just get some of the athletic skills and then the strategies and concepts that it took to be successful. And then all at once, I was on a big stage. I was a starting defensive tackle for the Cleveland Browns in the first Monday Night Football game ever. It was in September of 1970, and it was against Joe Namath and the Jets. And, when I was much younger, I was seeing Joe Namath, win the first Super Bowl for the AFL, and then that helped combine the leagues, his efforts in that game. It was also Howard Cosell's first game. You can see him on the left, and if you remember him, he was vitriolic, excitable, critical, He just kind of looked for the story. He would go into a game and he would make up his mind before the game of what it was going to be, and he would talk about it the whole time and kind of harangue. He actually did, though. He did a great job. He made Monday Night Football fun to watch, and people would tune in to him. But that first game, I had a difficult time. Everything speeds up from preseason to regular season. I had some good plays, but I had a lot of bad plays, and Cosell called me out. I think he would call me out if I'd had a perfect game, because that's what he had in mind. And he is basically, I don't have a good Cosell imitation, but there you go again. Joe Namath is teaching the rookie a lesson. So I didn't know about this, and I went home. I was excited. We won the game on a late interception. I couldn't wait to get the paper. I don't think I slept all night. I was living in an apartment in Berea, Ohio, and I heard the paper hit the stoop. And I opened it up about 5 or 6 in the morning, and it said Browns win first Monday night game. And then in a story down in the text, it said nightmare ends for Jerry Schurch. And I was like, what nightmare? And then it went into how Cosell had criticized me the entire game. And later on, after I retired, I wanted to do some writing and, with photography. And so I wrote for an article in Sports Illustrated called My Worst Day in Sports. And Jane Sherk, who's on the committee, said, and she was teaching at the time, said that she took that story and she told her class, and I guess there were some Schurchs in the class, and it inspired some young Schurchs. So I'm happy about that. I'm happy to hear about that. But I was able to grow because I had a really good mentor, and he's on the right. That's me on the left with the taped fingers. I believe it was 1971, which is my second year. That's in Cleveland Stadium, and we're walking off the field probably pregame. And Mo had played for the New York Giants and the Cleveland Browns. He played for 12 or 14 years, and he took a liking to me, and he understood what I needed to do to be a really good player. And he saw things in me that I didn't see in myself. So, after that game, I went to him. I said, Mo, did you see the papers? And I guess I had a terrible game. And he said, it wasn't that bad. And he said, you're going to be okay, kid. And then he said, this is what I see in you. And he told me some traits and, about my tenacity and my willingness to learn and things like that. And eventually, in 2 or 3 years, I became a good player. But I wanted to show this one picture of Mo because it's a great picture of him. Well, not so good of him because he's not really doing much, but looking. But when he was playing for the Giants in 1958, they had some championship teams. They came in second this year, and this is Mo number 77. We always used to kid him about his height because he was about 5'11", 6 foot, which is kind of short for a defensive lineman. But I think this is just as a student of photography, this is a beautiful picture with the dirt being kicked up, and Johnny Unitas, a Hall of Fame quarterback, rearing back. And this is called, in a lot of people's opinion, the greatest game. I looked it up recently. It was actually the first overtime game. I guess they didn't used to go to overtime, and it was the first really big televised game. And the Colts beat the Giants in overtime. And I was happy a few years ago to get a picture. I'd almost forgotten that I'd played against Johnny Unitas, that same quarterback. And this is I think a really fine picture. I'm stretched out. If Mo was around, I said, this is what you're supposed to do when you rush the quarterback, raise your hands. Of course, Mo wouldn't bother for you because it would still go over your hands. But we used to kid around like that. But this is actually a playoff game where the Colts beat us. And I think it was my first year. And that guard right there, who's about ready to hit me in the stomach, really handled me that day. And his name was Glenn Ressler. But anyway, I'm kind of proud of that picture. When I got that picture a few years ago, I had never seen it. And I opened the envelope and I went, you played against Johnny Unitas, Jerry? You're really old. But Mo guided me as a mentor and a coach, and he took me from here. And maybe you can't see it, but I read it all over my face. On the left side is my rookie card, and I was a pretty scared rookie. And if you look closely at the old look, the wet head was not dead then. But I was kind of like, where am I and what am I supposed to be doing? And I'm playing with the big boys now. And about 5 or 6 years later, after the lights went on and after some of the lessons that Mo taught me really sunk in, I became all pro. And I actually had one year where I was the NFL Defensive Player of the Year. And I attribute it a lot to Dick Modzelewski, Mo. And then as I went into my career about 3/4 of the way in, and I played 12 years. So at about 8 years, I got a pretty major injury, and I decided not to sit around the locker room doing nothing. And what can I do while I still have to be there? And I started talking to this fellow, Ronnie Kuntz, who was an Associated Press photographer, really great award-winning photographer there in Cleveland. And he took a liking to me, and he taught me photography. He told me what cameras to buy. He took me to the darkroom. Everything was black and white photography then. And he taught me how to, soup the film and do the enlargements and what to look for on the field and things like that. And we took a lot of trips together. We went to the Kentucky Derby and other sporting events. And he was just a great mentor too. And like Mo, he saw some things in me that I didn't see in myself. So I started taking pictures behind the scene, and it really helped me to make the transition from football as I looked back. And there were times where my knee was injured. This was in the locker room at Kent State University. The team is on the field practicing. I'm wishing that I'm on the field, or I hoped I would be on the field practicing with them, but my knee was just too lousy at the time. So I put my camera on a stool and turned the timer on, and I went over and picked up the weights. I didn't know at the time, but the split of the mirrors went right down the middle. When I looked at that film, I thought, that's a pretty apt picture, because that's how I'm feeling. I'm partway in football, but I'm partway out. And so the behind the scenes stuff really helped me with, I think, my transition, and helped me remember the good times and the really tough times. I came back 2 years after I retired, and I did a magazine spread for Pro Magazine, the NFL's magazine, and I stayed in training camp for 2 weeks, and I took tons of pictures, and I didn't set anything up. So this is the locker room at Lakeland College, where the Browns were practicing in the summertime. And I just walked in the training room, and these four fellows were getting therapy, and each of the therapy modes are actually working on something that's inherent in their position. So the guy on the left is a defensive lineman. He's getting traction, pulling his neck up, which is probably not the preferred method these days. It was pretty primitive, I guess. And the quarterback icing his arm, and a wide receiver icing his knee, and a linebacker with electric shock treatments and ice on his hamstring. So they use that in the spread. And then I'm really proud of the next picture. I call it the rookie. It was just to the left of that picture, the door to the training room opened up, and in the morning, Ohio being so flat, the sun came pouring down the hallway. And on the right were Gatorade tanks. On the left was a bench. And I thought, if somebody comes and sits on that bench, it might make a pretty good picture. And then for some reason, I was reading a photography magazine the night before, and they said, if you get a confluence of light, try smearing Vaseline on part of your lens. And so I took half of my lens and I smeared the Vaseline on. I didn't even talk to this young man. And I took a roll of 36 of black and whites and got this picture out of it. I sent it to him. He was a rookie free agent named Paul Farron. He weighed maybe 215, 220 at this time. And as an offensive lineman, that was too light. But he gained 40 pounds. I believe he played at 260, and he had an 8-year career. And then just a few more behind the scenes. This was my roommate, Lyle Alzado, who did some work in Hollywood. I think he beat up Vern, and Vern Goes to Camp, something like that. He had his own, I think it was a Fox series TV show for a while. And he had a very interesting person. He was very kind of vulnerable. And also there's a part of his personality that he was really tough. So this is on a plane ride going to a game, and he just turned around in his seat, and with that soft lighting from the plane window, I snapped a few. And so we used to call him Zados, Lyle Alzado. He played for the Broncos, the Browns, and then he won the Super Bowl with the Raiders. And then he was taking, he went public with this. He was taking human growth hormone and steroids and got a brain tumor and died at about 45 years old, sadly. A lot of football has to do with injuries. Usually you leave the game because of a major injury. So I call this Deacon's knee. Deacon was also my roommate on the road at times. And this is the new team doctor who eventually operated on me, Dr. Bergfeld, the old team doctor on the right with the sweater vest, Dr. Ippolito. And then the guy in a trance there with a cigar is Leo Murphy, who was the Browns trainer probably all the way from about 1947 to 1975 or so. But injuries were a huge part of the game. So the fellow sitting there on the bench, Deacon, was, waiting for the verdict. And, am I going to be able to play this year, or are they going to take me in and operate on me? And again, having that camera was really a good transition tool for me. So this was 1980, a year that I only played one game, and then my injuries kind of pulled me out of the action for the rest of the year. And this is old Cleveland Stadium. On Saturdays, we would practice in the stadiums, and it was just a walkthrough. And it was raining. The Cleveland, now they're the Guardians, they also played there, so that tarp covering the infield was granite, and they put the tarp over it so it wouldn't become, soupy granite. But I was feeling like kind of like where that split was in that previous image. I'm part way in, I'm part way out, and will I ever play again? I did come back and played one more year, and then I retired. And then after a career in photography, I spent a few years in photography after football, and I started my own freelance business out here in California. Then I just felt like I needed to do something else in life. I was bored, and I felt like there was something more in me. And I went back to school, and I studied something called athletic transition in psychology, along with counseling. And in grad school, so this topic focuses on the difficult move from high performance sports to private life. And it's not really acknowledged that much in public, although it is now more after CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. People are starting to realize that there's a price to pay for being a professional football player. And if you look at the research and the data, players almost always leave because of an injury. It's such a high paying job, especially now. You don't want to leave a few $1 million on the table. And then there's high levels of a divorce because of identity crisis, I believe. That's the biggest part. Depression, bankruptcy, drug addiction, and then, of course, the brain injuries. This is a photo that I actually took when I was doing that spread. And a couple of years after I retired. This is a rookie who had high hopes of making the team, although he's a free agent, and he had really no chance of making it. And this is the moment that he realized that he wasn't going to be an NFL football player, because I think the rookies were practicing, and then the veterans came back into camp, and he was an offensive lineman. And this was after a drill that he'd just been beaten like a drum. So his transition was starting right then. So then after studying athletic transition, what I was looking for was a model to go through the transition, kind of like a 12-step program Alcoholics Anonymous and so forth. But I didn't find anything that resonated with me. And if it didn't resonate with me, I thought, well, it's not resonating with other athletes either. So I was going to try to find my own model of transition. And so for me, it just kind of came to me after all the reading. And I don't even know if it was so much the reading, but these three things just came to me: that you got to let go, that you're no longer a football player. And I think that's what people coming out of sports have the biggest problems with. Your hero, you've got the focus on you, and then it's gone. So we're young enough that we need to master something new. And even the players coming out today, I don't get to talk to them too often, but when I do, I say it's not so much the money, although money, it's great to have money, but when you're a young person, you need to be doing something, and you can't sit around for 40 or 50 years. So you need to master something new. So the people, I think, the players coming out of football and then other sports that actually go into something else and put in the time and they're proficient at it, are the happiest. And then giving back, because, and I say this, and it came to me because sports is such a narcissistic endeavor. You're always focusing on yourself. I mean, you've got your teammates and you work with your teammates, but the only thing that you can control is yourself. So it's like how fast you are, how big you are, how mean you are, how tough you are, how persistent you are, how smart you are, all these different, it's always me, me, me. And I think the antidote to that in retirement is to focus on other people if you can. And it's also the formula for successful adult development, which we'll get into here in a minute. So I started out after graduating with a degree in psychology and was a counselor for a while. I started out with youth mentoring. I was working for a California state agency that was connected to the governor's office, and I was still learning about mentoring, but there were other people that were much newer to it than I was. And so I would be assigned to go out with programs. And in mentoring, there's a whole sort of formula that you have to have for youth mentoring, which has to do with so basically in youth mentoring, it starts out with safety, but so it's screening, recruiting, screening, training, matching, providing monitoring and support, and then positive closure. And so as I started doing trainings, I thought, well, why did I fall into mentoring? And I really like it, but what's my foundation for being somebody that really is a proponent of mentoring? And then I remembered that I had great mentors. As I had mentioned, my mom and my dad gave me the foundation. Coach Mo, he was, I could have a whole webinar presentation on how perfectly he mentored me. And then Ronnie Kuntz, who really, connected with me and wanted me to have success in the photography field. So that's one of the reasons that I became somebody who consults with mentoring programs. And just wanted to give you a sample of some of the programs I've worked with. And at the same time, these are the types of mentoring programs that are out there. So I've worked with a number of foster youth programs, and foster youth really need guidance. Children of prisoners, although it's actually a terrible name for the program, and I think they changed it eventually to opportunity youth. But people that have parents who are incarcerated. And then the vast majority of mentoring is school-based, one-to-one, meaning one mentor with one child or mentee. And then also group mentoring. I actually went into the school system in San Diego and created my own group mentoring programs and facilitated them for about 5 years. Can be kids that are performing at a high level. So some of the STEM and STEAM programs, science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, they have mentoring programs. I was involved with a program called Mentoring Young Black Men and Boys that came out of the Obama administration. And then one of the most unique programs I was involved with, I trained these mentors a couple times. It was mentoring young girls. Actually, it was women who were mentoring young girls who experienced the loss of their mother. So women who lost their mother at an early time in life who were mentoring girls in the same situation. And then federal employees, military, several prisoner reentry initiatives which combine career focus and mentoring, and U.S. Department of Defense. I've got a proposal in right now for the city attorneys mentoring program. So more seasoned attorneys in San Francisco mentoring the newer ones. So that's just a sample. And now I've got 2 or 3 slides on mentoring here. So the 2 main types of mentoring are the formal or structure or organized mentoring. So that's mentoring that goes through a program like Big Brothers and Big Sisters. And I just wanted to mention, if anybody is interested in mentoring youth through organized mentoring, typically this would work. Just put in your search engine, youth mentoring programs near me, and then just call a few and ask them what they're offering or look them up online. Spontaneous mentoring is really using the strategies that you learn about how to mentor somebody, but do it in everyday life. And so it doesn't have to be through a program. So in the next couple of slides, I'll talk about some of the techniques that you can use to be an informal mentoring. But I want you to know it's also known as everyday mentoring or mentoring in the moment or informal mentoring. So it's basically mentoring without a program. So spontaneous, it really begins with an attitude and putting on your mentoring hat and wanting to promote the growth and development and the well-being of others. And it can occur in a chance meeting. I've been on airplane rides where I've sat next to somebody and they mentored me. I told them what I was doing. They gave me some ideas and I tried them. Hopefully they worked. But I only saw that person on a 2-hour plane ride. But it can involve who to mentor. It can involve anybody, really, your children or grandchildren or other relatives, neighborhood kids, friends, coworkers, and strangers. Again, because it's an attitude and it's a technique, and I'll show you some of the techniques here in a moment. And it can be acknowledged as mentoring if you're doing spontaneous mentoring, but most of the time it doesn't have to be named. You don't have to sit down with somebody and say, well, do you feel like I'm your mentor? I feel like I'm your mentor. That can happen if it's over time, but in the shorter period of time, it probably wouldn't happen. And even sometimes longer, it doesn't have to even be named. I wanted to show you one exercise that I've actually done hundreds of times with both adult and youth mentoring programs. And so I talk a little bit about mentoring in the trainings, and then I'll break people into groups of 4, 5, or 6, and I'll hand out poster boards. I'll ask one person to draw an outline of an individual with no details on it at first, and then ask each participant to go up one at a time, but multiple times with colored markers and draw the trait of what they believe to be an ideal mentor. What would you want your mentor to have? What traits at the part of the body where that trait might exist? So you can see on this diagram, they put love and heart and smiles and ears for listening and open mind. And there's other drawings that there's actually more symbols involved, better symbols, but I just like the way these people really enjoyed doing this exercises. So I wanted you to see their smiling faces. Then after the exercise, we'll put all the charts on the wall, all the ideal mentors on the wall, and I'll ask, which symbols, which traits do they have in common? And after doing this for 6 months or a year, I realized that there are 2 common traits, or 2 traits that come up more than any other trait. And we do this with mentees, and so they actually come up with these same traits. And they are heart in the ear. So if you have a mentor, you want them to be heart-centered, which means focused on you And to do that, they need to actually listen to you. They observe, but they listen to what you're saying. So people that are being mentored want to be heard, and they want to know that you're invested in them and that you're a kind and caring person. And now for a few strategies. One is just to be aware that you have opportunities that you can call it mentoring, you can call it helping, you can call it caring. For me, I think of it as mentoring. So look for opportunities to put that hat on. Even sometimes you have to be an authority figure to somebody, but look for times you can take somebody aside and go, hey, let's just talk about this. What's going on? And then a really good way to mentor is find out what somebody loves. If they have an interest or a hobby or a career interest, whatever it is, and help them to achieve it. This is what we do in counseling too. Find out what somebody loves, help them get there. Identify their strengths. So in the last 10, 15 years in human services, we've talked about a strength-based approach and not so much criticizing people. You can remember the times we used to call young people that got in trouble juvenile delinquents. So how does it feel to have that label? But anyway, so identify their strengths and tell them, what you see in them, and it'll probably be more than they see in themselves, just like Coach Mo did with me and Ronnie Kuntz did with me. Listen more than talk. My wife says, receive more than transmit. So listen more than talk, although sometimes you may have to fill the space. And don't be an authority figure. Mentoring is not about telling somebody what to do. It's more like asking questions. And this is a huge one, don't expect changes, because if you expect changes, you're going to be frustrated. Your mentee or whoever you're talking to is going to be frustrated, and there's going to be a separation. You won't be developing the relationship. So if you go, I don't know why you did this or that or the other, it creates a lot of distance. And then again, focus on the relationship. So Doug Schurch helped me put this together, and he said, well, you should talk about one of your mentees. And I said, well, that seems like bragging. And he said, well, if you don't talk about a mentee or a situation, then people aren't going to get the picture. So I'm going to talk about one of my mentees. And so he's a fellow, and I'll call him Nick. That isn't his name, but Nick, I met him when he was 18. Somebody alerted me to him that he was in a tough situation. He was living with his mother in a room in some folks' house that kindly let them live there, but he was a social isolate. He was 18, but he dropped out of school in the 6th grade. He almost didn't leave his room, but he had a love of sports, and I would go over and I'd pick him up and we would drive around. And so that's, number 2 is find out what they love. So we talked a lot about sports. He talked about how he had a successful hockey career till he was 9 years old. And then his dad got violent, and then him and his mother went on the run from his dad. And that's why they were, in part, why they were so isolated. So then identify their strengths. As I was talking to him, I just thought, and I said it in a subtle and hopefully in a kind way. I went, you're more normal than most people that I know. And then I also, I talked about some of the phobias I had, because he had a real phobia of actually meeting people. He would almost rather erase himself from the face of the earth than have to introduce himself to a new person. So I told him some of my phobias, and he went, oh, yeah, a professional football player can be afraid too. Well, I guess I can be afraid. And he didn't say that to me, but he actually did say that in a certain way. And then I didn't try to be an authority figure. Sometimes I would suggest things to do, and sometimes he would disappoint me, as in number 6. And I would just try to maintain my emotional balance and just kind of see it through. And actually he comes over and works on our yard, and he didn't have a job, and his mom died, and that's how we got a little bit of money to him. So he helped us, and then we helped him, and now he's living in a better situation, and he's working in fast food. And so it's kind of a bit of a success story. But I never tried to absorb that success. I've been a counselor where I thought that I helped heal somebody, and then I'll read their name in the newspaper of them committing some crime in the next week. So you just kind of lean towards the light, as Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, would said, lean towards doing the right thing, and then things will take care of themselves. And then I've had other mentors who I'd never met. This is Dr. Eric Erickson, who's a developmental psychologist. And especially now as I'm getting older, I want to read more about adult development. So what Dr. Erickson realized is that in the 1950s, that we don't stop growing as people when we're 30 years old, which all other developmental psychologists thought that that's it. So he came up with four child stages, but 4 adult stages of identity, intimacy, generativity, and integrity. And I'm highlighting generativity, and he actually coined the word, and there's a lot of words that are close to it: generator, generous, ingenious. So they all seem to be really, really good words. But he said it's caring. And he said that generativity is the ability to care for the next generation. And he said that's being a successful adult. And if you look at, many of these developmental models, they all go from being more focused on yourself to getting older, kind of like a grandparent, and then being able to focus on others. And so I put in this picture of my dad, probably in about 1990 or so, or a little bit before, with our son Michael in our home in Cardiff. And you can see that he is the doting grandparent. He's got pleasure all over his face. And Erickson used to say the outcome for a successful life is to be a doting grandparent, and not that you physically need to have grandkids, but also that's an attitude. And so just a couple things on the reading list. Some of my favorite books, if you want to learn more about adult development in sort of the Ericksonian stages, I've read this book a couple of times and I like it. I actually met the author years ago, George Valiant. It's called Triumphs of Experience, and he talks about those later stages of life of being generative, and then also the last stage is having integrity. A favorite book is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And I won't read the quote because we're kind of backed up on time, but especially the second part of the book where he describes his psychological model and talks a lot about finding meaning. I think it's one of the great books. And then a recent book I read, Lost Connections. It's I think we have an epidemic of depression and anxiety in our society, and those things are related. And this person did a lot of research because he was depressed and heavily medicated, and he found his way out through connecting with relationships, making sure he was doing right work, being in nature, having meaningful values, and a few other things. So I talked a little longer than I thought I would. And I appreciate you hanging in there. And now I'll try to exit this screen and get some faces back up there.
Thanks, Jerry. That was an extremely great symposium of mentoring, as well as your background. If people have questions, please use the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. We already have a few in the queue here, so without hesitation, let's go to some of them. Jerry, you've mentioned the role that grandparents can play in mentoring their grandchildren. Are there 1 or 2 key musts the grandparents should do to successfully play this role? And at the same time, are there 1 or 2 nevers they should avoid?
That's a good question. And I think that grandparents are usually pretty good at it. Erickson says that the successful outcome for life is to be a doting grandparent. And I think for most people, that's just kind of natural. And you always hear that, they can spoil the grandkids and then turn them back over to the parents, which is great. So I would say to do a lot of things that you would as a mentor, but they're also, again, natural to parenting, which is to see the best in them. My wife's mom, my father-in-law used to he used to have like tons of his grandkids over at the house, and they would go around in a circle. They had a downstairs where you kind of had to go around the circle, and as they go around the circle, he'd pick one out and he'd hold him on his lap, and he'd say, "Michael Schurch, did I ever tell you that you're the smartest, the most?" And then he'd pick another. We used to call it his catch and release. So I would just say, act like a grandparent, and don't take the role of the parent, which would be a disciplinarian, unless you have to.
Great. In your opinion, what's the biggest reason why a player transitions successfully from their athletic career?
Good question. I think it's the ability to let go and to be patient with yourself. I years ago I studied a lot of I read a lot of men's studies, and I really found a lot of good information when I focused on studying the hero. And in a couple different books, they asked the same sort of rhetorical question: what do you do when you're done being a hero? And the answer is you die, because it's a short-lived thing and you have to move on to the next thing. So if you're able to put that behind you and realize that people hold you up on a pedestal because of their own needs and not necessarily for who you are, then it's a lot easier to be accepting and to not get mad at people, and then to realize that, hey, I'm a sports fan too, and I kind of worship some of those guys now, like I used to get worship. Yeah.
Tell us about how the mentoring of vulnerable populations differs from other populations.
Well, when the term vulnerable populations comes up, to me, it usually has to do with trauma, because people who have been traumatized are more vulnerable. So that could be child abuse, it could be poverty, it could be sickness, it could be a lot of different things. So usually you're focusing more on their basic needs. The psychologist Maslow has that hierarchy of needs, and on the bottom, the things that you need most, number one is safety, number two is belonging, and then at the apex, at the top, it's like self-actualization. So you might not get so much into self-actualization with those folks as in just kind of creating a safe place and creating the connection. All the psychological models, or most of the ones that I've seen, the first thing you have to do is to develop trust. And so if you can develop a relationship with a young person and they can trust you, then they begin to trust the world. They say, "Oh, I know Jerry, and he's an old guy, and he's this old white guy, and he's an adult, and I don't like adults, but I like Jerry, but so maybe some of the other adults are okay too."
Great. We have about 5 minutes left. The next question is, are you still practicing photography, and what other subject matters have you photographed aside from sports?
I don't really practice it, but it's now my hobby, and I've gone from using a digital camera to using my iPhone. I usually try to get one of the latest iPhones, because they seem to capture images which I can't even do on my digital camera. So I love taking pictures. We have two dogs, and I've got 1,000 portraits of our two little rescue dogs. Family members, my mom and dogs. I probably have a few hundred of my mom and one of our dogs, Lucy, because Lucy loves grandma. And I love to take pictures of nature. Our son is temporarily living in the Owens Valley in Independence in Inyo County, and I was up there recently, and the mountains are magnificent. It's the Eastern Sierras, and the sunsets, the sunrises, the snow on the mountains. It's just beautiful. So I love to take pictures in nature.
Great. Uh, do you find the rate of successful transitions higher or lower from when you were a professional athlete?
That's a good question. I typically talk to the older guys because the newer guys are pretty busy with playing football, the current guys. But when I did my research on athletic transition, kind of a simple formula that I realized was the more money, the more problems. Because the more money and the more rewards of sport, you have more of a focus. Your focus just gets more, if you got contracts that are 10 and 20 million dollars, you're not going to get a job answering the phone and calling people up trying to sell them something. You're going to be like lifting weights. So when I talk to guys that played in the 1950s, I would ask them about their transition. They say, what transition? I was selling insurance and I was making more money out of, they were making 5,000 as an insurance salesman and 4,000 in football. So their transition was pretty darn smooth. So I think it's probably harder. And I think maybe the more focus now with this compressed media, especially social media, the inability to even go out and be in public. And so I think they're probably more isolated, and I think it's probably harder.
That would certainly make sense given all the other pressures that athletes receive today. We got time for one more question. How has the scope of your services changed over the 25 years you've been providing those services?
Well, I started out teaching it when I didn't know it because it was so new. Youth mentoring exploded about 1997, 98. And I knew psychology, so I knew something about trying to relate to young people. So I was teaching it before I knew it. And then 6 months later, I knew it. And then I had my own programs. I had group mentoring programs in San Diego City schools, and I would work with 3 or 4 groups or actually in 3 or 4 schools, maybe 2 or 3 groups a day. So I was doing direct services. And then after that, I started helping programs. So I used to have some joy working with the kids. Now my joy is helping people that help kids. So I train staff and I train mentors. So basically from direct services to helping people who actually work with the kids.
Great. Well, we are at the top of the hour, and I want to thank Jerry very much for taking the time to talk about his career and his transition into being a thought leader in the mentoring business, or the mentoring field. We want to thank him for his presentation, and as well as the questions from the audience. And we'd also like to thank everyone who was online today joining this Zoom session. We look forward to any comments or suggestions at schurchsymposium@gmail.com. Have a great rest of your weekend and a healthy, happy holiday season. Be well, and for now, goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Go Schurchs.